Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a fascinating, highly consequential, real-world collision. We are going to look at exactly what happens when the digital, completely borderless fiction of global finance crashes headfirst into the cold, unyielding physics of energy infrastructure. Really, it's a story about how the multi-billion-dollar machinery we build today can absolutely trap us tomorrow, and how, despite what market theorists might tell you, physical geography still dictates global power.
To really wrap our heads around this, let's start with a massive number, 13.5 million. That is the sheer volume, in barrels, of crude oil that is pumped out of the United States every single day. Just to put that into perspective, that is enough to fill over 800 Olympic-sized swimming pools daily. This historic output totally cements the U.S. as the undisputed top oil producer in the entire world. I mean, on paper, it looks like absolute bulletproof energy independence.
But wait a second. We immediately have to contrast that massive figure with this number, 6 million. Because 6 million barrels is the volume of foreign crude oil the U.S. is still forced to import from global markets every single day.
So naturally, you might be wondering, why on earth does the world's top oil producer rely so heavily on foreign imports? It poses a glaring paradox, right? It's kind of like owning this massive, booming apple orchard, but you're still walking next door to buy apples from your neighbor just to bake a pie. This isn't a failure of extraction, though. It's actually a mystery of physical chemistry and economic theory, and it's exactly what we're going to solve together right now.
Here's how we're going to break this down. First, the fuel security paradox. Then, the crude oil spectrum, the refinery bottleneck, the distillate deficit, capital versus territory, and finally, the spatial fix.
All right, starting with Section 1, the fuel security paradox, and why independence is kind of an illusion here.
Let's just shatter a really common illusion right off the bat. Gross extraction volume simply does not equal domestic energy security. True energy resilience is dictated by a rigid, completely physical alignment between the chemistry of what you pull out of the ground and the physical blueprints of your downstream processing infrastructure. Basically, a nation can be practically drowning in its own record-breaking crude oil, yet still face catastrophic domestic fuel shocks if its physical refineries don't actually match its geology.
Which brings us to Section 2, the crude oil spectrum. Let's look at why not all oil is equal.
So dipping into the hard science for a second, the general public tends to behave as though oil is just oil, a generic black liquid. But that is a massive chemical error. Notice the stark contrast we have here. On one side, there's ultra-light sweet crude. This is typical of the U.S. domestic shale boom in places like the Permian Basin. It's thin, low viscosity, and virtually sulfur-free. It literally flows almost like water. On the flip side, we have heavy sour crude, which is what's imported from regions like Canada or the Middle East. This stuff, it is incredibly dense, thick as molasses, and just packed with heavy metals and sulfur.
Let's see how that plays out in Section 3, the refinery bottleneck and the infrastructure trap.
We need to examine how multi-billion-dollar machinery dictates a nation's capabilities, entirely independent of what it actually pulls out of the soil. To understand this trap, we have to look at fixed capital. Decades ago, U.S. Gulf Coast refineries invested billions, literally billions, to install complex secondary processing units, like cokers. These were specifically engineered to boil and break down cheap, sludge-like heavy imports. This huge investment locks the territory into a highly specific path. You cannot easily or cheaply just pivot this massive metallurgical machinery to run on something else. And this brilliantly illustrates what we call the light crude bottleneck. If you try to run that water-like domestic shale oil through these heavy-duty refineries, it's honestly like putting premium sports car fuel into a massive industrial dump truck. It just bypasses those expensive secondary cracking units entirely. Those multi-billion-dollar towers, they literally just sit there idle and completely inefficient. Because retrofitting them is so prohibitively expensive, the entire system is forced into a reliance on heavy foreign imports just to keep the machinery running at peak thermodynamic efficiency.
Moving to Section 4, the distillate deficit and the terrifying 72-hour cascade.
Let's walk through the real-world consequences of this bottleneck if we ever faced a major geopolitical crisis or a maritime blockade. It triggers a catastrophic industrial chain reaction known as the 72-hour cascade. Step 1. A maritime blockade cuts off those heavy sour imports. Step 2. In an absolute panic, domestic light shale oil floods the distillation towers to compensate. Step 3. We immediately hit what's called the Naphtha ceiling. Because the oil is so light, the towers get overwhelmed with light end vapors, causing a massive overproduction of standard gasoline. But then, Step 4 hits, the distillate deficit. Light sweet oil lacks the complex heavy carbon change you need for heavier fuels, so suddenly you have an absolute shortage of middle distillates, specifically diesel and jet fuel. Now those are the metabolic fluids of commercial freight and military logistics. Without them, grocery store shelves go empty, Amazon packages stop moving, and flights are grounded, even though you technically have all the oil in the world.
This brings us to Section 5, Capital versus Territory, the macro collision.
You see, this whole refinery bottleneck is actually a symptom of a much grander structural tension. We are witnessing a clash of two fundamentally different operating logics. On one hand, you have interest-bearing capital. Its primary goal is borderless market fluidity, maximizing profit and accelerating the speed of turnover. But on the other hand, you have territorial imperatives. The state operates on a completely different logic, one of physical security, national survival, and asserting absolute sovereignty over its material geography.
And this tension leads us to the highly profitable global export-import loop known as the circuit of arbitrage. To manage the refinery mismatch and maximize returns, specifically the crack spread, which is just the profit margin between raw crude and refined fuel, private capital mandates a specific flow. It says, import discounted heavy crude to run those legacy refineries perfectly. Then, process it and export our premium domestic light shale oil to global mega refineries in places like Asia or Europe that were actually built for it. Now, it is incredibly efficient for global markets, but as we just saw with the 72-hour Cascade, this logic of capital realization actively undermines sovereign national security the second a crisis hits.
Finally, Section 6, the Spatial Fix, and how we attempt to manage these contradictions.
To really tie this together, we have to look at the strategic framework surrounding territorial reorganization. Marxist geographer David Harvey coined a brilliant concept known as the spatial fix. Essentially, when capital faces a crisis of overaccumulation, it switches surplus funds into the long-term built environment, what he calls the secondary circuit. We build massive, deeply rooted physical infrastructures, like our complex Gulf Coast refineries, to solve the economic problems of today by reorganizing physical geography. But there is a massive catch.
Listen to this incredibly powerful quote from Harvey. Capital creates a physical landscape and spatial relations appropriate to its needs and purposes, only to find that what it has created becomes antagonistic to its needs at a future point. That is exactly what happened here. The multi-billion-dollar heavy sour refineries were the ultimate spatial fix for the 1990s. But today, in the era of domestic light sweet shale, that very same infrastructure has become a massive, antagonistic liability.
So what's the actual solution here? Well, when the borderless fluidity of global finance inevitably breaks down, states have to rely on proactive territorial defenses. They must do a few things. 1. Bridge the extraction to refinery gap, perhaps by mandating expensive domestic retrofits. 2. Harden maritime and digital choke points by deploying strategic fleets. And 3. Recalibrate infrastructure to serve the long-term reproduction of life and labor, meaning actually building physical things that keep citizens safe and society functioning, rather than just acting as a speculative sink for surplus cash.
Which leaves us with one final, deeply provocative question to ponder today. When the digital fiction of global finance collides with the unyielding, hard physics of a blockaded maritime choke point, who really holds the power? Does the market just smooth things out, or does the material geography of our own fixed capital trap us? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep questioning the hidden physical structures that run our world.